At Christmas dinner, my dad lifted his glass, called me worthless, and pressed the keys of a $120,000 Tesla into his girlfriend's hand. The room erupted in laughter, the kind that stung more than any slap, and I sat frozen while the chandelier light danced across their smug faces. But under the table, my phone buzzed, each notification announcing another account of his being locked, his empire collapsing one freeze at a time. Nobody at that table knew it yet, but this was the night everything turned upside down, and what followed would tear open every secret we had tried to bury. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the cab was the way the snow clung to the edges of the driveway, like it had been carefully arranged there, as though even the weather knew better than to disturb the perfection of my dad's house. The estate loomed against the Chicago night, its windows glowing warm and golden wreaths hung on every pane, the kind of picture that could have been printed on the cover of a holiday card. Strangers would think it looked inviting, magical even, but my chest tightened the moment I saw it. For me, that house was never a place of comfort. It was a stage where roles had been scripted long ago and where I had never fit the part I was assigned. I paid the driver, shouldered my bag, and walked slowly up the icy steps. The chill in the air cut through my coat, but it was nothing compared to the cold I felt rising from inside. Even after all these years, stepping onto this property made me feel like the same girl who had always been told she did not belong, no matter how hard she worked or how high she reached. I paused at the front door, my gloved hand hovering over the brass handle. From within came the muffled sound of laughter glasses clinking, the hum of voices gathered in celebration. My pulse quickened. The door opened before I could knock. Charles, the butler who had been with our family for as long as I could remember, gave me a stiff nod. His face was lined now, older than the last time I had seen him, but his posture had not changed, always dignified, always controlled. "Good evening, Miss Lopez," he said. His tone was polite but distant, as if I were a guest rather than blood. He stepped aside and I walked in. The warmth of the house hit me immediately, almost suffocating after the sharp night air. The scent of pine needles from the massive Christmas tree, mixed with roasted turkey, spiced ham, and something sweet, maybe cinnamon or nutmeg. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor, the sound echoing faintly in the cavernous entryway. Above me, the chandelier sparkled with 100 tiny flames, casting its light down on garlands draped along the banisters and ribbons tied with perfect bows. Voices carried from the grand living room, where a fire blazed in the stone hearth. My eyes swept across the room until they found him. My dad, Richard Clark, stood tall in his tailored charcoal suit, a glass of red wine in his hand. His hair, now peppered with gray, was combed back meticulously, his posture as commanding as ever. He looked at ease, surrounded by guests, his laughter booming above the others. On his arm, like an ornament carefully chosen to impress, was Vanessa Reed. Vanessa was 32 younger than me by 4 years, but dressed like a woman who believed she had already won the game. Her crimson dress shimmered under the lights, clinging to her body in a way designed to draw eyes, her blonde hair styled in loose waves. She tilted her head back when she laughed, her hand brushing against my dad's chest, staking her claim with a gesture so casual it almost looked natural. Almost. It took only a moment for my dad to notice me. His eyes flicked in my direction, his smile cool and thin. "Melissa finally decided to join us," he said loudly enough for half the room to hear. Heads turned. Conversations paused. For a second, I felt every gaze settle on me, assessing, judging. I forced my shoulders back and lifted my chin. Vanessa's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Melissa," she said in a sing-song tone, "you made it. We were beginning to wonder if your patients needed you more than your family. Tonight." A soft ripple of laughter spread around her. I nodded politely, murmured greetings to people I recognized. Old business partners, wives in glittering jewelry, men with too many stories about deals struck and fortunes made. They looked at me like I was an outsider, and maybe I was. The only face that gave me comfort was my grandmother's. Margaret sat in a cushioned armchair near the corner, wrapped in a wool shawl. Her silver hair glowed in the firelight, her eyes kind when they met mine. She lifted her hand in a small wave, and my chest loosened slightly. Dinner was called, and we all moved to the dining room. The long mahogany table gleamed with polished crystal and china rimmed in gold. Tall candles flickered in silver holders, their flames dancing in the draught from the servants carrying trays. A roasted turkey sat in the center, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, cranberry sauce, and rolls that still steamed. It looked perfect, too perfect, like everything else in this house. I was seated across from my dad and Vanessa, an arrangement I suspected was intentional. Vanessa's hand rested on his knee beneath the table, her smile radiant as she whispered something in his ear. I sipped my water, watching the way he laughed at whatever she said. The first courses arrived, and with them came conversation. Guests praised my dad's success, complimented the decorations, toasted the season. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice pitched just high enough for everyone nearby to hear. I imagine being a doctor must keep Melissa terribly busy. Though I suppose it is more fulfilling than profitable. The comment drew a few chuckles, though some guests glanced at me uneasily. My hands tightened on my napkin under the table, but I said nothing. I had learned long ago that arguing only gave them more power. My dad cut in his voice, carrying effortlessly over the murmur of the room. You know, Melissa had every opportunity to follow the right path. I wanted her to study law to carry on what I built. Instead, she chose medicine, a noble profession, of course, but hardly one that will ever place her where she belongs. The room went quiet for a beat, then filled with the sound of glasses clinking and polite laughter. My face burned, but I kept it carefully neutral, focusing on the glass of red wine in front of me. My grandmother shifted uncomfortably, but she remained silent. Then my dad stood lifting his glass to command attention. I have an announcement, he said, his voice booming. The conversations fell away, all eyes on him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek key fob. The light from the chandelier glinted off the silver, catching everyone's attention. For everything you are, for everything you bring into my life, I want you to have this. He turned to Vanessa, his eyes shining with pride. Her hand flew to her mouth in a practiced gesture of surprise, though her eyes already sparkled with triumph. Gasps and applause rose around the table. He placed the Tesla key into her hand, holding her fingers longer than necessary, then looked straight at me. She is everything I wished my worthless daughter had been. The words cut sharper than any knife. Laughter erupted around me, some genuine, some nervous. My stomach clenched, but I kept my expression calm. Under the table, I reached for my phone. The screen lit up, casting a soft glow against the linen. A notification waited at the top, a reminder of the plan I had been building piece by piece. My thumb hovered over the glass. Not yet, I thought. Not until the moment was perfect. Vanessa waved the key fob like a trophy, turning to me with a smile so sweet it made my teeth ache. Don't be jealous, Melissa. Some of us are simply born to shine. I met her gaze and let the faintest smile curve my lips. Around us, guests cheered, raised their glasses, clapped their hands. They were too busy celebrating a love that was nothing but theater to notice, the storm quietly gathering at their table. I lifted my wine, the stem cool in my fingers, and took a slow sip. The laughter filled the room, bouncing off the walls, but inside me, there was only stillness, a steady calm waiting. I never knew my mother. Her absence was the first fact of my life, a shadow that stretched across every birthday candle, every school recital. Every night I cried myself to sleep. People told me she was beautiful, kind, graceful. They said she had a laugh that filled the room, that she would have adored me. But those words were only pieces of a picture I could never hold. What I had instead was my dad's voice reminding me that she was gone because of me. He did not whisper it, he never softened it. He would look at me with eyes that carried more grief than love, and tell me, flat out, that my birth had cost him his wife. When I was little, I believed him. Children believe the people who raise them, even when the words cut like knives. I remember standing in the grand living room, staring up at the portrait of her above the fireplace. My mother's eyes sparkled in that painting, her lips caught in a smile, as if she were alive and frozen at the same time. I would whisper apologies to her, thinking maybe if I said it enough, she would forgive me for something I had never chosen. My grandmother Margaret would find me sometimes, her soft hands cupping my cheeks. She would say, "You did not take her away, sweetheart. She gave you life, and that was her gift." But Margaret's voice was only one among many, and my dad's was louder. Dad carried his grief like a badge of honor and a weapon at the same time. When he drank, which was often, the words came sharper. If you had not been born, she would still be here. I would flinch not just at the sound, but at the certainty in his tone. My small body would curl up on the couch, wishing I could vanish into the cushions. That was my childhood. Not lullabies, not bedtime stories, but blame that seeped into my bones. School was where I learned to breathe. I found a rhythm in textbooks and notebooks, in grades that shined like medals. My teachers praised me, said I had potential, said I was bright. For a fleeting moment, those words felt like love. I would rush home, report card clutched in my hands, only to watch my dad glance at the straight A's and shrug. That is what is expected. Nothing more. My joy dissolved as quickly as it came. By the time I turned 14, the conversations about my future began. Dad made them less conversations than declarations. "You will study law," he said. "You will inherit Clark Development Group." It was not a suggestion. It was a command spoken over dinner in the car in the hallways of our home. He spoke of it as though it had already happened, as though my life were a contract signed at birth. But something in me resisted. The idea of sitting in a courtroom defending clients, of climbing into the chair at a boardroom table with men in dark suits, felt like a prison cell dressed in velvet. I craved something different. I wanted to mend rather than to argue. I wanted to place my hands on the broken and make them whole again. At 16, I found myself in a hospital waiting room after Margaret had slipped and broken her hip. I sat beside her as doctors and nurses hurried past. One nurse crouched down to comfort a sobbing child across the hall. Her voice was calm, her hands steady. In that moment, something sparked inside me. That was the kind of work I wanted to do. To be the steady voice in the chaos, the hands that healed. When I told Dad it was summer, the air smelled of cut grass and cigar smoke from the back patio where he sat. I gathered my courage and said I wanted to be a doctor. At first, silence. Then the sound of glass slamming against wood, the amber drink spilling across the table. His face twisted, his voice harsh. "You killed your mother and now you want to kill my legacy." The next morning, I found my credit card broken in half on the kitchen counter. A note in his slanted handwriting read only 2 words, "Sink or swim." So I swam. I worked double shifts at a diner, balancing trays heavy with greasy food, while my classmates studied in quiet libraries. I cleaned apartments on weekends, the smell of bleach lingering in my hair long after I left. I tutored younger kids for extra cash, my fingers stained with ink from the notes I scribbled late into the night. My body ached, my eyes burned, but every time I put on that white lab coat, every time I opened a textbook, I felt alive. My grandmother tried to help. She would press folded bills into my hand when she thought I was not looking. Sometimes I accepted. Sometimes I refused, not out of pride, but out of determination. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it without him, that I was not the worthless child he believed me to be. There were nights I thought I might break. Nights when the exhaustion pressed so heavily on my chest that I struggled to breathe. I would lie awake in my dorm staring at the ceiling, hearing his voice echo. "You killed her. You ruined everything." Tears would slide silently into my hair, but when morning came, I rose again. Because every step forward was proof that he was wrong. Years blurred together in that rhythm of struggle. I graduated, applied to med schools, earned my place in New York. When the acceptance letter arrived, I held it in my hands like it was the first piece of real evidence that I was worth something. I wrote to my dad not for his approval, but because some small part of me still wanted him to know. The silence that followed was its own answer. No call, no letter. Nothing. Margaret, though, never wavered. She called often, her voice soft and proud. She asked about my patience, my long hours, my exhaustion. She told me she saw my mother in me. I clung to those words like they were oxygen. By 25, I had stopped waiting for him to change. I stopped imagining him appearing at my white coat ceremony or sending flowers on graduation day. What replaced hope was something colder. Resolve. If he would not see me, then I would build a life so undeniable he could not ignore it. And underneath that resolve was a quieter whisper. One day he will pay for what he has done. The first year in New York nearly broke me. The city never slept, and neither did I. The residency program at the hospital consumed every waking hour and sometimes the hours when I should have been sleeping. My shifts blurred together, days melting into nights until time lost meaning. I lived in scrubs, ate whatever I could find in vending machines, and learned to ignore the constant ache in my body. The smell of antiseptic clung to my hair. The beeping of monitors echoed in my ears long after I left the ward. I would step outside at dawn, the air heavy with exhaust and the chatter of a city already alive, and I felt both invisible and invincible. No one knew me here. No one looked at me with eyes filled with blame. For the first time in my life, I could breathe, even if the breaths were shallow and ragged. There were nights when exhaustion sat so deep in my bones that I thought I might collapse. I remember one particular shift, 30 hours straight, my eyes burning as I checked the vitals of an elderly woman who kept reaching for my hand. She whispered, "Do not leave me, honey." I squeezed her fingers and promised I would stay. Hours later, when her breathing steadied, I sat beside her bed and closed my eyes just for a moment. The nurse woke me with a gentle tap, and I stumbled onto the next patient. That was the rhythm of my life. Pain, exhaustion, fleeting moments of triumph. Each time I saved a life, each time a patient's family hugged me with tears in their eyes, I felt a fire kindle inside me. I was building something not with money or power, but with the strength of my own two hands. My dad's voice still lingered in the back of my mind, telling me I was worthless, but here in the chaos of the hospital, I was needed. I rented a tiny apartment on the Upper East Side, barely big enough for a bed and a table. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbor arguing with her boyfriend almost every night. The heating clanked in winter and the air conditioning sputtered in summer, but it was mine. I paid for it with my own money earned from my own work. Every rent check I wrote felt like a small rebellion, a declaration that I was surviving without him. Margaret called often. She would ask if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping at all. Her voice was soft, a lifeline that pulled me back from the edge when I felt myself unraveling. I told her about my long hours, my patience, the way my body ached. She listened and always said the same thing. Your mother would be proud of you. Those words carried me through nights when I thought I could not keep going. I made friends with other residents, though our conversations were mostly fragments exchanged in the hallway, interrupted by alarms and pages. We laughed when we could sometimes at things that were not funny, because laughter was a survival tool. There was Daniel, a surgical resident with dark eyes and quick hands. He was brilliant, sharp, and carried a confidence I envied. We grew close, long nights spent together in the break room, sharing stories over stale coffee. He became the first person I let into the walls I had built around myself. For a while, it felt like something real. We leaned on each other, comforted each other after hard losses, celebrated small victories. He knew pieces of my story, though I never told him everything. He understood enough to see the scars, but life in residency was unforgiving, and love was fragile under the weight of exhaustion. Eventually, we drifted apart, our schedules pulling us in different directions. Still, he left an imprint, a reminder that I was capable of being seen, even briefly. Despite the hardships, I grew stronger. I learned to stand tall even when my body trembled. I learned to hold a scalpel steady even when my hands ached. Each year built layers of resilience I had not known I possessed. By the time I finished my residency, I was no longer the girl my dad had dismissed. I was a doctor, capable and determined, yet every success carried a shadow. At every milestone, a voice inside whispered, would he care now? Would he finally look at me and see something other than disappointment? When I received recognition for a research paper, when I was offered a fellowship, when patients wrote letters of gratitude, I imagined sending them to him. I never did. His silence had taught me enough. But the anger never faded. It simmered beneath the surface, waiting. I told myself I did not need him, that my life was proof I was stronger than his rejection. Still, I carried the wound, and wounds left unattended fester. By the time I was 28, I had built a life in New York, but the ties to Chicago tugged at me. Margaret's health was declining. She urged me to come home for Christmas, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. I knew my dad would be there, Vanessa at his side, the spectacle of their life on full display. Part of me wanted to refuse to stay safe in the distance I had built. But another part of me, the part that had spent years swallowing his words, wanted to stand in that house again and show him who I had become. So I booked a ticket. It was during my 3rd year in New York when the first cracks in my dad's empire reached me like whispers carried on the wind. I was leaving the hospital after another brutal shift, my body running on caffeine and determination, when one of my patients, a middle-aged man with a heart condition, struck up a conversation. His name was David Harper, and he happened to work at a bank back in Chicago. He had recognized my last name on the intake form, though he was polite enough not to press. He mentioned offhandedly that the Clark Development Group had been under scrutiny lately, something about loans that did not add up, accounts that seemed too carefully hidden. I nodded, pretending indifference, but my pulse quickened. For weeks after, I could not shake his words. The idea that my dad, who had always prided himself on control and power, might have weaknesses buried under all that arrogance lit something inside me. It was not joy, not exactly, but a sense of possibility. For years, he had held all the power, reducing me to nothing in his eyes. But what if there were cracks he could not patch over? I began digging quietly at first. Every free moment between shifts, every quiet night when the city buzzed outside my apartment, I searched. I learned how to trace corporate filings, how to follow the trail of shell companies and hidden accounts. My medical training had sharpened my mind to look for patterns, and now I turned that skill toward my dad's world. The more I uncovered, the more my anger hardened into resolve. Still, I knew this was dangerous ground. He had built his empire on intimidation and image. If I was going to challenge him, I needed help. That was when I thought of Helen Rivera. Helen was 40, a lawyer specializing in financial crimes, someone I had met briefly through a mutual friend years ago. I reached out, unsure if she would even remember me. To my surprise, she agreed to meet. We sat across from each other in a small cafe tucked into a corner of Manhattan. She wore a navy suit, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp behind her glasses. "You have your dad's name," she said. "That alone makes this tricky. But if what you are telling me is true, then he is in deeper than you realize." I slid a folder across the table printouts of what I had found. Shell companies routed through Delaware, suspicious transfers overseas, loans secured against properties that barely existed on paper. She studied them, her brow furrowed. Finally, she looked up. "This is enough to open a case. But Melissa, this will not be quick. And it will not be clean." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I do not want quick. I want thorough. I want him to feel every piece of this." She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right. If we do this, we do it carefully, step by step." From that day, Helen became my ally. We met regularly, often in quiet corners where no one would notice. She taught me how to gather evidence without leaving trails, how to request public records, how to interpret financial jargon meant to confuse. She connected me with people who could help, including David Harper, who agreed to speak more candidly once Helen assured him of confidentiality. The picture that emerged was darker than I had expected. My dad's company was drowning in debt disguised as expansion. He had funneled millions through offshore accounts, using Vanessa's social media brand as a convenient cover for laundering. Investments that seemed flashy on the outside were hollow inside, designed only to impress. For the first time in my life, I saw proof that the man who had called me worthless was not untouchable. I carried this secret with me through every shift at the hospital, every long night when my body ached and my eyes burned. There was a strange kind of balance in it. By day I healed, I stitched, I soothed. By night I planned, I schemed. I sharpened the blade of revenge I had been carrying for years. Margaret noticed a change in me. During one of our phone calls, she said, "Your voice is different, stronger. What are you doing out there, sweetheart?" I hesitated, then told her only part of it. I said I was building something that I was tired of being small in his shadow. She sighed, a sound full of both sadness and hope. "Just be careful," she whispered. Months turned into years. The case built slowly, piece by piece. Helen was meticulous, refusing to move forward until everything was airtight. Sometimes I grew impatient, wanting to strike, but she would hold me back. "If you want him to fall," she said, "it has to be permanent." The opportunity finally came the fall before that Christmas. Helen called me one evening, her voice brisk. "We have enough. If you want to freeze his assets, we can, but it has to be timed perfectly." She explained how it would work, how the orders would go into effect within minutes once I gave the confirmation. All I had to do was pick the moment. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, the city humming outside my window. I thought of every insult, every time he had called me worthless, every time he had turned his back. I thought of my mother, of the life she never got to live, and of the life he had tried to take from me. Then I thought of Vanessa, her laughter ringing in my ears, the way she looked at me across the table as if I were less than nothing. That was when I knew. Christmas dinner. The night he would be surrounded by friends and admirers, basking in the glow of his perfect image. That was when I would take it all away. Vanessa always had a way of speaking that made even her cruelties sound like jokes. It was polished, practiced, the tone of someone who had spent years performing for cameras and audiences. At that Christmas dinner, sitting across from her, I felt the sharp edges of her words with every sip of wine she took, every smile she flashed. The conversation had turned to careers. A man seated 2 chairs down mentioned his son who had just graduated from law school. That was all the opening she needed. Vanessa leaned forward, her elbow brushing lightly against my dad's arm, and said in a voice that carried down the length of the table, "I suppose not everyone was cut out for law. Some people choose different paths, like Melissa here. Being a doctor must be noble, though I imagine it doesn't exactly cover the kind of lifestyle we are used to in this family." A ripple of laughter followed. I felt the sting rise in my chest, but my face remained composed. Years of swallowing his insults had trained me well. Dad chuckled, his voice booming. "That is true. She had every opportunity to stand beside me, to learn the business, to inherit what I built. Instead, she chose to spend her days in hospitals." He shook his head, a look of mock pity crossing his face. "It is not exactly the future I envisioned." I pressed my fingers against the stem of my glass, steadying my hand. My grandmother shifted in her chair at the far end of the table, her eyes flicking toward me, her lips pressed tight. She never spoke against him at these gatherings, but I saw the sorrow etched in her face. The dishes arrived in courses each more elaborate than the last. Roasted duck, glazed carrots, potatoes whipped with cream, rolls still warm from the oven. The food was perfection, but every bite turned heavy in my mouth. Vanessa chattered endlessly, complimenting the guests, telling stories that highlighted her charm. Yet every few minutes, her eyes slid back to me, gleaming with satisfaction, as if my discomfort were her true meal. At one point, she leaned closer across the table and said, with that same sugary tone, "Melissa, you must be used to cafeteria food by now." Hospital meals, I mean, not exactly like this. Her laugh rang out, and several people joined her. I placed my fork down slowly, letting the silence stretch for just a second before I smiled faintly. Some of us find nourishment in different ways. My voice was calm, almost light, but the way she blinked told me she heard the edge buried in it. Still, my dad picked up the thread. He shook his head, his eyes glittering with amusement. She always had a sharp tongue. Too bad it never translated into the courtroom where it could have been useful. The table erupted again, laughter spilling like wine, filling every corner of the room. I felt the heat climb into my cheeks, but I kept my breathing steady. Inside, I repeated the words Helen had said to me just days earlier: patience. Timing is everything. My phone buzzed against my leg, a small vibration no one else noticed. I slid it from my clutch and glanced down. A message from Helen glowed on the screen. "Confirm now. Everything is ready." My thumb hovered for a moment. I slipped the phone back out of sight. Not yet. Instead, I reached for my water and took a sip, letting the coolness wash down the tightness in my throat. The evening dragged on, the chatter constant, the laughter unrelenting. Vanessa thrived in the attention, her hand never leaving my dad's arm. He basked in it too, enjoying the spectacle of being admired, praised, envied. I sat quietly, a ghost at his table, the daughter who had failed to meet his standard. To them, I was small, invisible. But beneath the calm mask, I wore something fierce, stirred. Every insult, every laugh at my expense, every reminder of what I was not, was fuel. And I knew the moment was drawing closer. The turkey was carved. The gravy poured, the cranberry sauce passed around. Vanessa raised her glass and toasted to love, to family, to the future. My dad kissed her cheek and the room applauded. I joined in with a polite clap, the sound of my hands measured, controlled. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Helen's words, simple and sharp. "The board has been notified. Assets are in position. Say when." I let out a slow breath, my gaze fixed on the key fob that still rested beside Vanessa's plate like a jewel. Her fingers stroked it absently, her smile radiant. I knew then that the moment was coming. Not tonight, not in the middle of their laughter, but soon. Very soon. I straightened in my chair, folded my napkin neatly, and forced a smile as another round of laughter circled the table. They thought I was beaten silence small. They had no idea how close they were to the edge. The room had reached that stage of the evening when the laughter was too loud and the wine too free. Glasses clinked in rapid rhythm, candles flickered, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and perfume. My dad thrived in moments like these. He was standing now, his voice booming as he spun a story about his latest deal, his hands slicing the air like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Vanessa sat beside him, her shoulders back, her smile gleaming, one manicured hand stroking the Tesla key fob as though it were a prize she had won. I watched them from across the table, my face a mask of calm. Inside, my pulse thudded with steady precision. The weight of my phone in my lap was a reminder of everything I had prepared. The plan was in motion. All that remained was the moment. My dad raised his glass again, commanding the room with a single gesture. To Vanessa, he declared, "The woman who has given me back my youth, who has shown me loyalty and devotion beyond measure." Around the table, guests lifted their glasses, voices merging into a chorus of cheers. Vanessa's eyes shimmered, and she leaned into him as if this display were proof of her victory. My grandmother sat quietly near the end of the table, her expression unreadable, though I saw her fingers tightening around her napkin. She glanced at me, a flicker of worry in her eyes, but she said nothing. She had lived too many years in his shadow to believe words could change him. I slipped my phone from my lap, the glow of the screen hidden beneath the tablecloth. A single message from Helen sat waiting. "All assets are ready. Confirm to execute." My thumb hovered for a second, the chatter around me fading into a low hum. Then I pressed confirm. The change was invisible at first. My dad kept talking, his laughter rolling over the table. Vanessa beamed clinking glasses with the woman beside her. But then his phone buzzed on the table, once, twice, then again. He ignored it at first, waving his hand as if the world could wait. But the buzzing continued, insistent. He frowned, picked it up, glanced at the screen. His face shifted. The flush of wine drained, replaced by a pallor I had never seen on him. He tapped the screen, his fingers jerking, his eyes scanning. The room carried on, oblivious to the storm gathering in his chest. I watched him, my wine glass steady in my hand, and felt a calmness unlike anything I had known. Another buzz. Then another. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring. He set the phone down hard on the table, but not before I caught the glow of the notification. Account frozen. Funds locked? Vanessa leaned closer, whispering something, but he did not hear her. He lifted the phone again, scrolling, his breath quickening. His eyes darted, scanning line after line. The notifications spilling faster than he could read them. His empire was crumbling, one frozen account at a time. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip, the stem cool against my fingers, the wine rich and smooth on my tongue. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I whispered so quietly that only I could hear. Around me, the room remained oblivious. Guests continued laughing, their conversations weaving together in a tapestry of ignorance. But I saw the panic spreading across his face, the cracks forming in the mask he had worn for decades. He tried to stand taller to maintain control, but his hands trembled as he set the phone down. Vanessa frowned now, sensing something was wrong. She picked up the phone herself, her manicured nails tapping the screen. I watched her lips part, her eyes widening. She looked back at him, confusion clouding her perfect expression. "What is happening, Richard?" she hissed under her breath. Nothing, he snapped, too quickly, too harshly. But it was not nothing. The storm had broken, and only he and I knew it. The conversation at the table swelled around us again, oblivious to the silent war unfolding. Someone to my left told a story about a vacation in the Bahamas, laughter bubbling as they described a mix-up at the airport. Another guest chimed in about his son making partner at a firm downtown. The chatter was ordinary, filled with trivial triumphs, but beneath it, the undercurrent of tension pulsed like a second heartbeat. My grandmother shifted slightly in her chair, her eyes flicking to me again. She knew something had shifted, even if she did not yet know what. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water, and for the briefest moment our eyes locked. She gave me the smallest nod, so subtle no one else could have seen it. I let my gaze drift back to my dad. He was trying to laugh again, forcing a smile, but it looked wrong on his face, brittle and strained. He lifted his glass, though his hand shook enough that the wine sloshed dangerously near the rim. Vanessa pressed closer to him, her whisper sharp, but he ignored her, his eyes glued to the phone in his palm. I felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow rise in me. This was the man who had spent his entire life telling me I was worthless, the man who had blamed me for my mother's death, who had tried to control every step of my life. And now, before my eyes, he was unraveling. I had not screamed, I had not fought him in the way he expected. I had stayed silent. I had been the silent revenger, and that silence was louder than anything he had ever thrown at me. At the far end of this table, one of his business associates leaned forward. "Richard, he called you are quiet tonight. Everything all right?" My dad's head jerked up, his eyes wide for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a forced smile. Of course, he said quickly. "Just a small distraction. Nothing important." But I saw the doubt flicker across the man's face. I saw the way his eyes narrowed, curiosity sparking. One seed of doubt planted, ready to grow. I leaned back in my chair, the warmth of the wine spreading through me, and let the noise of the room wash over me. My phone buzzed in my lap again, and I glanced down just long enough to read Helen's second message. "First transfers confirmed, everything is locked." I closed my eyes for a second, breathing in the moment. The plan was no longer a plan, it was reality. When I opened them again, I caught Vanessa staring at me across the table. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion dawning. She leaned close to my dad, whispering urgently, her nails digging into his arm. He shook her off, but I knew she would not let it go. The evening stretched on, the laughter still flowing, the wine still poured, but beneath the glittering surface, a fracture had opened. No one else could see it yet, but I could, and soon so would they. My dad's mask began to crumble in real time, and I sat there watching it with the quiet intensity of someone who had waited her entire life for this exact moment. His phone kept buzzing, vibrating against the polished wood of the dining table, rattling like a guilty conscience that would not quiet down. He tried to silence it, pressing his thumb against the screen, but the notifications kept coming, each one carrying another nail for the coffin of his empire. The laughter around us started to thin. Guests noticed the tension first in his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw, the way he gripped his glass but did not drink. Vanessa leaned closer, her crimson dress shimmering under the chandelier as she whispered urgently, "Richard, what is going on?" Her smile faltered for the first time that evening, though she tried to keep her voice soft. Nothing he hissed, but his tone was sharp enough to cut. His eyes darted around the table, aware now that people were watching. He forced a smile, lifted his glass, and muttered something about business never taking a holiday. A few polite chuckles followed, but the warmth of the evening was already fading. Vanessa glanced at the phone again, her manicured nails tapping against the screen. She read one of the notifications, her lips moving silently. Then she looked back at him, her expression turning cold. Frozen accounts. What does that mean, Richard? Her voice rose just enough to carry across the table. Heads turned, eyes widened. The room shifted. Conversation stalled. People leaned closer, sensing something was wrong. My dad slammed the phone face down on the table, his knuckles white. "Eat, drink, enjoy yourselves," he barked. But his voice shook, betraying him. I felt my pulse steady. For once, I was not the one being laughed at. For once, the shame belonged to him. Vanessa sat back, her face tightening as realization settled in. The Tesla key fob still lay beside her plate, gleaming like a cruel joke. She picked it up, held it in her hand as if its weight had suddenly changed. "This was supposed to be mine," she whispered, her eyes narrowing. "What good is a car if the money behind it is gone?" Her words were not meant for me, but I caught them anyway. My lips curved into the faintest smile hidden behind my glass of wine. My dad pushed back from the table suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with a screech that cut through the room. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his face flushed. "Enough of this," he shouted. His voice no longer carried confidence. It carried panic. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some leaned back, whispering to each other. The grandeur of the dinner, the illusion of perfection, was unraveling. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is your doing, isn't it?" His words rang out sharp and accusatory. "You ruined everything just like you ruined your mother." The room went silent. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Gasps echoed against the walls. Even Vanessa looked startled at his outburst. I felt the air leave my lungs, but I did not flinch. I sat still, letting the silence stretch. I had imagined this moment so many times, the weight of his blame pressing against me, but now, instead of pain, I felt clarity. His rage was no longer my burden. It was his confession. Around the table, the guests shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided looking at me. Others stared openly, their faces etched with disbelief. My grandmother's hands trembled as she pressed a napkin to her lips, her eyes glistening. Vanessa broke the silence first. Her voice was sharp, slicing through the tension. "What do you mean, Richard? What did she ruin?" Her eyes darted between us, calculating, searching for the truth. He faltered. His mouth opened-closed, then opened again. He looked at me as if daring me to speak. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with deliberate care. Then I met his gaze. Some legacies were never meant to survive. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but the weight of it carried through the room. Gasps rippled around the table. My dad's chest heaved, his face mottled with rage. He grabbed the Tesla key from Vanessa's hand and hurled it across the room. It clattered against the wall and fell to the floor, the sound sharp and final. Vanessa recoiled, her eyes wide, her perfect composure shattered. The whispers began almost immediately, a low hum that grew louder as guests leaned toward each other. A man near the end of the table whispered something to his wife, her face blanching as she nodded. Another guest shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tugging at his tie, his eyes darting toward the door. Vanessa bent down, her hands trembling as she retrieved the key fob from the floor. She stared at it for a moment, her fingers curling around it tightly, then set it back on the table with a sharp clink. Her smile was gone now, replaced with a hard line. Her eyes turned cold, her voice brittle. "If everything is gone, Richard, then what am I even doing here?" Her words cut through him sharper than mine ever could. His head snapped toward her, his face twisting. "Do not speak to me like that," he snapped. But the crack in his power was already visible. The guests could feel it. The empire they had admired, the man they had followed, was no longer untouchable. His anger was not strength, it was desperation. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. He thought he was exposing me, but all he had done was expose himself. The chandelier above flickered slightly as the storm outside pressed harder against the windows. For a moment, the room was cloaked in shadows, the firelight flickering across faces that no longer carried joy, only unease. Then my grandmother's voice, frail but steady, broke through. "Richard," she said softly, her words trembling but clear. "Enough." The room stilled again. My dad's mouth opened as if to argue, but he stopped. The sight of his mother's weary gaze silenced him more effectively than any accusation. His shoulders sagged, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. It was the first time in my life I had seen him diminished not by me, but by the weight of his own choices, and it was only the beginning. The silence after my dad's outburst hung heavy in the room, thicker than the smoke that drifted from the fireplace. His words lingered sharp and poisonous, suspended in the air for everyone to taste. "You ruined everything just like you ruined your mother." I felt the eyes of the guests shift between us, their curiosity laced with discomfort, their fascination outweighing their manners. Vanessa sat frozen, the corners of her mouth twitching as though she wanted to say something but could not decide which mask to wear. My grandmother's trembling hands clutched the edge of the table, her face pale but her eyes steady on me. For the first time, I did not shrink under his accusation. I looked directly at him, my chin lifted, and I saw not the giant of my childhood but a man unraveling. His phone continued to vibrate, rattling against the table like a guilty conscience that refused to stay silent. He tried to ignore it, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. I reached for my glass, let the stem rest against my fingers, and spoke clearly enough for the entire table to hear. Some legacies do not survive the truth. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but the weight of the words filled the room. A murmur rippled among the guests. Chairs shifted, forks clinked against plates left unfinished. Vanessa finally found her voice. Her tone was sharp, her eyes narrowed, her painted nails drumming against the table. "What is she talking about, Richard? What truth?" He glared at me, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. That silence was my invitation. I pulled my phone from my lap, the glow of the screen illuminating my face. The notifications had multiplied evidence of the storm I had unleashed. I tapped once, and the file Helen had sent me opened. The document was damning. Charts, bank transfers, records of shell companies, all linked to his name. I turned the screen so those nearest could see. Some leaned forward, squinting at the words, then whispering to their neighbors. It spread like a current through the table, curiosity igniting into shock. My dad slammed his fist on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. "Enough," he barked. "No one needs to see this." He reached for the phone, but I pulled it back calmly, pressing the lock button and slipping it into my clutch. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her face was flushed, her eyes sharp. "Is this true, Richard? Tell me this is not true." Her voice trembled, and for the first time that evening, the confidence drained from her. He reached for her hand, his voice softening. "Sit down, Vanessa. It is nothing. Just business." She jerked her hand away as though his touch burned. "Nothing," she spat. "Your accounts are frozen. Your empire is collapsing. What did you drag me into?" The guests no longer bothered to hide their whispers. Some shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in with the thrill of scandal. Years of admiration and envy for my dad were cracking before my eyes. My grandmother's voice broke through, steady despite her frailty. "Enough of this charade, Richard." She turned her gaze to me, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Melissa, you do what you must." Her words, simple and resolute, were the blessing I had been waiting for all my life. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh, her hands shaking as she reached for the Tesla key fob, still lying forgotten, near her plate. She held it up, the light catching the silver. "This is worthless now," she hissed, her voice cracking. "All of it is worthless." She threw it onto the table, where it slid across the polished wood and landed near my glass. I picked it up slowly, the cool weight resting in my palm. I held it up for everyone to see, then set it back down deliberately in front of her. "Keep it. It suits you." My tone was even, but the sting of the words made her flinch. My dad's face darkened, the veins at his temple pulsing. His control was slipping, and he knew it. He turned on me, his voice a growl. "You think you have won. You think you are better than me." His eyes burned with fury, but beneath it I saw something else. Fear. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze without blinking. "This was never about being better. This was about showing you that I am not worthless, that I never was." The room erupted, then a chorus of whispers and gasps, the scandal too great to contain. Some guests stood gathering their coats, eager to flee before the walls crumbled further. Others lingered, hungry to witness the fall of a man who had spent decades convincing them of his invincibility. My dad's phone buzzed again. He grabbed it, his fingers fumbling as he read the screen. His face went pale, the blood draining until he looked almost sick. He dropped into his chair heavily, the weight of defeat pressing down. Vanessa moved towards the door, her heels clicking against the floor. She did not look back. The Tesla key fob remained on the table, a hollow prize she no longer cared to claim. I sat in silence, my grandmother's hand finding mine under the table. Her touch was warm, grounding me as the world around us shifted. I knew this was only the beginning. The truth had been revealed, but the storm had not yet finished its work. The guests began to scatter after Vanessa stormed out, their footsteps echoing in the long hallways as coats were fetched and hurried. Goodbyes were whispered. The air in the dining room had shifted from celebration to discomfort, the once lively hum replaced by awkward silence broken only by the clinking of glasses being cleared away by staff. My dad sat slumped at the head of the table, his phone clutched in his hand, his face pale and drawn. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller than the room around him. I stayed seated, my grandmother's hand still holding mine. Her touch steadied me, but my heart pounded. The plan had worked, but I knew this was only the surface. The true fallout had not even begun. My dad finally looked up, his eyes locking on me. They were bloodshot, his voice hoarse when he spoke. "You think you've won, Melissa?" His tone was quieter than before, but no less venomous. "You'll regret this." I did not flinch. For years I had been the child who bowed her head under his rage. But not tonight. I held his gaze and said softly, "The only thing I regret is waiting this long." The silence between us stretched until Margaret spoke, her voice thin but firm. "Enough, Richard." She pushed her chair back slowly, her frail hands gripping the edge of the table. "This family has lived in your shadow for too long." She turned her eyes to me, then back to him. "Melissa is not your downfall. Your pride is." Her words cut deeper than mine ever could. My dad's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked away, his jaw tightening, and stared down at the glass of wine in front of him, as if it might offer escape. The staff began clearing plates. One of them, a young woman barely older than I had been when I left home, looked at me with something like gratitude in her eyes. I wondered how many of them had endured his temper behind the closed doors of this mansion. Later that night, when the house had grown quieter, I wandered into the library. The fire still burned low, the scent of smoke heavy in the air. The shelves towered above me, lined with books my dad never read but displayed for prestige. I traced my fingers along the spines, thinking of the years I had spent here, alone, desperate for approval. I heard footsteps and turned. My grandmother stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked smaller than I remembered her frame, fragile, but her eyes held strength. She crossed the room slowly and sank into the armchair nearest the fire. "You did what needed to be done," she said quietly. I sat opposite her, my hands clasped in my lap. "It feels unfinished. Like it is only the beginning." She nodded. "It is only the beginning. The truth has a way of rippling outward. People will talk. His reputation will crumble. And you, my dear, you must be ready for what comes next." I stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in my glass of water. Part of me ached with exhaustion, but another part was alive with a sense of justice I had never felt before. For once, I was not powerless. The following morning, the real consequences began to appear. News alerts pinged my phone before the sun was even up. Headlines spoke of frozen accounts, sudden investigations, whispers of fraud. Reporters camped outside the gates of the Clark estate, their cameras pointed like weapons. I watched from the upstairs window, the cold glass pressing against my palm. My dad had always controlled the narrative, but now it was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. When I finally came downstairs, he was already in the study, pacing, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was sharp, desperate. "I told you to fix this. Do something, I don't care how." His words were harsh, but his tone carried panic I had never heard before. He saw me standing in the doorway and glared, his hand tightening on the phone. "Get out!" he snapped. "This is your fault." I stepped into the room, calm, steady. "No," I said. "This is your fault. Years of lies, years of greed. You built this on sand and now it is collapsing." His face twisted with rage, but there was no power behind it anymore. He pointed at me, his hand shaking. "You are nothing without me. Nothing." I felt my lips curve into a small, quiet smile. "That is where you are wrong." Morning broke heavy and gray, the kind of Chicago winter sky that pressed low over the rooftops, threatening snow, but holding it back as if the clouds themselves were waiting. I had not slept. I lay awake in the guest room of the mansion, listening to the quiet creaks of the old house, remembering the echoes of last night's chaos. The laughter that had once filled these halls was gone. What replaced it was silence, fractured only by the occasional sharp sound of my dad's voice drifting from his study. He had been awake too, pacing, raging into his phone, trying to salvage what could not be saved. I rose, pulled on a sweater, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but beneath it was a calm I had never known. The kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from victory. Downstairs, the air was tense. Reporters were still outside the gate, their voices carrying faintly through the frosted windows. My grandmother sat at the kitchen table, her shawl wrapped tight, her hands cradling a cup of tea. She looked up when I entered, her smile tired but proud. "You did it," she whispered. I sat beside her, my hand covering hers. "We did it." The door to the study slammed and my dad appeared, his face ashen, his suit rumpled from a night spent fighting battles he could not win. His eyes locked on me, burning with a hatred that no longer frightened me. "You will pay for this, Melissa." He pointed a trembling hand, his voice cracking. "You think you are better than me? But without this family's name, you are nothing." I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. I met his gaze head on, my voice steady. "I built my life without you. Every step I took was mine. You cannot take that away." His mouth opened, but no words came. He turned away sharply, retreating back into the study, slamming the door behind him. The day unraveled quickly. News vans gathered headlines, screamed former associates distanced themselves. Vanessa gave an interview to a local reporter before she even packed her bags, painting herself as a victim, insisting she had been deceived. She left with her designer luggage piled high in the back of a black SUV, never once looking back at the house she had once tried to claim. By afternoon, the phone lines in the mansion were buzzing constantly, but fewer and fewer calls were answered. My dad's empire was collapsing faster than even Helen had predicted. I stood at the window upstairs, watching it all unfold. For years I had dreamed of this, and yet living it was surreal. Justice, when it finally arrives, feels both heavy and freeing. That evening, my grandmother called me into the living room. She sat in her favorite armchair, the firelight flickering against her face. "Sit with me," she said softly. I obeyed, sinking into the couch across from her. "You must understand," she began, "that revenge can feel like an ending, but it is also a beginning. You have carried his hatred for too long. Now you must decide what to carry forward." Her words struck deep. I thought of my mother, of the life she had been denied, of the child she had left behind. I thought of the years I had spent chasing approval that would never come, the guilt that had weighed on me like a stone. For the first time, I felt that stone lifting. Later, when I returned to New York, the hospital greeted me with its familiar chaos. The beeping of monitors, the rush of footsteps, the steady rhythm of healing. I walked those halls with a new sense of purpose. I had faced the shadows of my past and survived. More than survived, I had reclaimed my power. Sometimes in quiet moments, his words still echoed, worthless, nothing. But they no longer pierced me. They were hollow, powerless against the truth I now carried. As I sit here telling you this story, I know it is not only mine. It belongs to anyone who has been told they are less than, anyone who has carried guilt that was never theirs to bear, anyone who has been silenced by voices of power and fear. My revenge was not just about taking away his empire. It was about proving to myself that I was never the burden he made me believe. And now I turn to you. Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, told you were nothing? Have you ever dreamed of the moment you could rise and show your true strength? Share your story with me. Leave a comment, let your voice be heard. And if you felt this story, if it stirred something in you, do not forget to like and subscribe, because here our voices matter.